Mason Hale fled the sky, but the sky found him. Denver was supposed to be the end of the line, a quiet tomb for the trauma he shared only with his German shepherd, Rex. Then the seal-stamped envelope arrived, a cold metallic scent clinging to the paper, naming him heir to a derelict hydrogen balloon, a ghost from a secret project his dead uncle called Aurora. Mason thought it was just scrap, a heavy antique. But as he stood in the forgotten hangar, a faint radio signal pulsed. X-47 link, standby mode. He didn't just inherit a relic, he woke a watcher. And tonight, deep in the Montana dark, someone else is watching, waiting for the relic to fly again. Because if the wind still moves, then the sky still remembers. November. In the high plains of Denver brought a kind of oppressive, static stillness, not the clean silence of winter snow, but the heavy, leaden press of a sky perpetually too low, too gray. The air was thin and dry, carrying the constant, muffled drone of distant highway traffic, a dull, reliable monotony that Mason Hale had meticulously chosen for its dependable lack of surprises. His life now, 5 years after the fact, was an exercise in controlled smallness, confined mostly to the dusty footprint of his modest ranch home in the far suburbs, a stark, deliberate contrast to the chaotic, vast open spaces where he had once lived and breathed as a highly skilled Air Force pilot. At 42, Mason carried the permanent, subtle stoop of a man 10 years older, the physical manifestation of carrying unseen weight. His eyes, a washed-out blue that rarely focused on anything above the roofline, were perpetually shadowed, tracing the hard lines of a singular memory he could not extinguish. He kept his sandy hair cropped short, highlighting a sharp, determined jawline that now mostly looked tired. Often covered by the sandpaper texture of 3 days' stubble, he never bothered to shave unless a trip to the supermarket was absolutely unavoidable. He was still physically fit, lean from nervous energy and the constant low-level vigilance that defined his protracted struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder, but every muscle felt permanently braced against an invisible impact, a catastrophic return to freefall. The anchor holding him to the slow-ticking reality of the present moment was Rex, a formidable 7-year-old German shepherd of intimidating size and exceptional intelligence, possessing a stunning sable coat and steady eyes the color of pale amber. Rex wasn't officially a certified service animal, a bureaucratic step Mason had consciously avoided, but the dog was Mason's shadow and his unflinching early warning system. Rex's temperament was steady, serious, and deeply intuitive, sensing the subtle spike in Mason's heart rate or the slight tremor in his hand long before a flashback tightened his chest into a vice grip. Their routine was sacred, a ritual of control. Cold black coffee, a meticulous 3-point check of all door and window locks, and a long, brisk walk away from any area where the wide, flat horizon could make the world feel too exposed and too much like the sky. The crash, 5 years ago, had been brutal and unforgiving. A catastrophic, inexplicable systems failure at critical altitude that instantly cost his co-pilot his life and, subsequently, stole Mason's ability to look up without seeing the ground rushing to meet him in a final, dizzying blur. He had traded the dizzying freedom of the high-altitude cockpit for the confining imprisonment of the Earth, and he hadn't once regretted the cage until today. It was just past the early afternoon when the package arrived, delivered by the local postman, Gary. Gary was a short, robust man in his late 50s with a slight paunch, a permanent flush of windburn on his cheeks, and a quiet, efficient manner that never demanded conversation. The perfect ancillary figure for Mason's isolated existence. The package, however, was anything but standard. It was a thick, cream-colored linen envelope, sealed not with tape, but with dark red wax pressed with the intricate old-world silhouette of a stylized angel's wing, a design Mason faintly recognized from his childhood, a forgotten image associated with his family's eccentricities. The sender was listed simply, starkly, the estate of Arthur Hale. Arthur, his late uncle, had been the family anomaly, a theoretical aerospace engineer who worked in the secretive, high-clearance fringes of the Department of Defense until he abruptly vanished into quiet, self-imposed retirement 15 years ago, only to be rediscovered now, posthumously, by this single strange sealed letter. Mason felt a tightening in his stomach, a strange blend of mounting dread and cold curiosity, a feeling entirely new to his carefully curated peace. Mason used a dull, stainless steel letter opener to break the archaic seal, watching the dried wax crack and crumble onto the kitchen counter. Inside was a heavy parchment document detailing the will. Mason Hale, named as his sole living heir, was bequeathed surprisingly little except for one highly specific, meticulously detailed item, an antique, experimental, hydrogen-filled aerostat named Project Aurora. The document specified the precise, remote location of the aerostat, a set of ambiguous coordinates in a desolate area of rural Montana, hundreds of miles from any recognizable town or landmark, and a separate, small, folded piece of notepaper, the hydrogen balloon, the very thing that defined the perilous heights Mason now avoided, was now his to claim. It felt like a bizarre, almost deliberately cruel joke from a man who, he knew, had been fully aware of Mason's dramatic, self-imposed grounding. The Air Force had stripped Mason of his wings and his honor. His dead uncle had just handed him a bizarre, metallic new set. The entire process seemed to demand that he face the very thing that had broken him. Mason took a long, steadying breath, running his thumb over the Montana coordinates, before unfolding the final slip of paper. The handwriting was Arthur's, precise, almost mechanically neat, but carrying an unmistakable tremor of deep-seated urgency. It was neither a standard warning nor a helpful explanation, but rather a cryptic directive, a philosophical command that felt like a challenge launched directly from beyond the grave, pulling Mason from his routine. He read the looping, thin script aloud, his voice unusually raspy from disuse, Rex's sensitive ears immediately twitching to the sound of his master's unfamiliar tension. If the wind still moves, then the sky still remembers. Mason stared hard at the coordinates, a blank spot of potential danger on the map. The faint, metallic tang of the sealing wax still on his fingertips, slowly realizing with a chilling certainty that this was not a simple inheritance. It was, terrifyingly, an activation. The next morning was not a day for quiet contemplation. It was a day for decisive, desperate movement. Mason packed the heavy leather duffel bag he hadn't touched since his discharge, a relic containing old maps, survival gear, and the kind of rugged, functional clothes that smelled faintly of jet fuel and high altitude. The only time he felt truly organized was when facing a physical task, an urgent objective. He loaded Rex into the back seat of his beat-up, dark green pickup truck, a vehicle whose faded paint and dependable engine perfectly mirrored his own need for anonymity and reliability. The journey was long and monotonous, 2 days of chewing up desolate interstate and winding 2-lane roads that sliced through the silent, unforgiving heart of the American West. Every mile away from Denver felt like a calculated risk, a direct challenge to the comfortable imprisonment he had built for himself. But the coordinates, that blank spot on the map and the chilling final message from his uncle, demanded his presence, overriding the 5 years of carefully constructed avoidance. Rex, sensing the shift in routine and the serious focus in Mason's body language, remained silent and watchful, his powerful head resting alertly on the console between the seats, his amber eyes acting as silent co-pilot and constant moral compass. The fear of the sky was a persistent, cold knot in Mason's stomach, but the dread of the unknown secret left behind by Arthur was a hotter, more immediate pressure compelling him forward. They crossed into the vast, sprawling openness of Montana, the terrain changing from high desert scrub to miles of rolling, seemingly endless prairie grassland that stretched to meet a huge, indifferent sky. Following the increasingly granular coordinates provided by Arthur, Mason eventually turned the truck onto a barely visible gravel access road, the tires kicking up plumes of choking brown dust. He drove for another half-hour until the ground began to slope into a wide, shallow valley, where, finally, the navigation ended. In the middle of the desolate, untamed prairie, where only prairie dogs and the occasional scavenging raptor made their homes, stood an incongruous monument to forgotten Cold War ambition, a colossal structure of rusted corrugated steel that stretched across the landscape like a beached metal whale. It was a massive, cylindrical hangar, its scale disproportionate to the emptiness surrounding it, the exterior scarred by decades of punishing weather and utter neglect. The front was dominated by a pair of gargantuan, sliding metal doors, the paint mostly flaked away, revealing the corrosive orange patina beneath. But Mason could still make out the faded stenciled lettering above the track, chilling in its clarity. U.S. Aerostat Research Facility, 1959. Parking the truck out of sight behind a clump of struggling aspens, Mason and Rex approached the facility on foot. The air here was heavy with the smell of old oil, oxidation, and the sharp, clean scent of hydrogen. A metallic tang that prickled the back of Mason's throat and set his military training alarms buzzing after years of silence. The main doors were secured by a heavy, ancient chain and padlock, which Mason easily dismantled with a small but specialized bolt cutter from his gear bag. The sound of the chain dropping onto the gravel felt like a detonation in the pervasive silence. He pulled the massive door open just enough to squeeze through, Rex slipping in smoothly beside him, tail low, his movements cautious and methodical. Inside, the sheer scale was dizzying. The single vaulting space swallowed all available light, making the dust motes dance in the few weak shafts piercing the roof. And there it was, the object of his inheritance. It was an enormous, gleaming silver teardrop, the hydrogen envelope dwarfing the cavernous space, suspended by heavy cables from the steel roof trusses. The aerostat, seemingly preserved in a time capsule, was majestic and terrifying, a silently waiting monster named Project Aurora. Beneath the massive silver hull, a small, heavily shielded metal compartment hung, serving as the gondola or control module. Wires, thick and insulated but clearly decades old, snaked from the gondola and disappeared into a monolithic block of reinforced concrete set against the back wall, clearly serving as the facility's primary power and communication junction. Mason cautiously entered the gondola's cabin. It was cramped but organized, filled with banks of analog dials and archaic radio equipment, the relics of 1950s technology. He found a main power switch, shielded by a thick plastic cover labeled auxiliary power, and flipped it on. A wave of faint electrical humming filled the dead air. Mason fiddled with a heavy, dust-caked radio set, adjusting the frequency dial until he hit a point that wasn't just static, but a deliberate, repeating pulse. A highly coded transmission that sliced through the noise, accompanied by a flickering, almost invisible light on a nearby console. The light was green, pulsing slowly, and beneath it, a tiny, half-hidden digital readout display showed 2 lines of text, frozen in time, but suddenly activated. X-47 link, standby mode. Mason realized with a jolt of icy dread that the colossal silver aerostat was not the primary asset. It was the forgotten antenna, the long, dormant link to something far more significant. A silent orbital sentinel known as the X-47 Atmospheric Observation Station, now awakened from its long sleep by the flip of a single switch. Miles away, positioned strategically atop a barren, shale-strewn ridge that provided a perfect, uninterrupted line of sight down into the desolate valley, sat a nondescript, reinforced black Chevrolet Suburban. The SUV was custom-built for surveillance, tinted heavily enough to be opaque even in direct sunlight, bristling with complex communication antennae and sensors that were discreetly housed within the roof rack. The sole occupant was Elias Cole, a man whose outward appearance was one of deliberate, forgettable professionalism, but whose internal landscape was one of chronic, high-tension surveillance. Cole was in his late 50s, his face perpetually etched with the deep creases of worry and long nights spent staring at screens. He was a tall, lean man, wearing a sharp, tailored gray suit that seemed entirely inappropriate for the Montana wilderness, suggesting he answered to a command structure that prioritized presentation over practicality. His hair was impeccably managed, silver at the temples, contrasting sharply with his intense, focused hazel eyes. He was a retired Air Force technical officer who had served 2 tours in the Gulf before becoming one of the most trusted quiet troubleshooters for the Defense Detonation Agency, DDA, a shadowy government division whose jurisdiction covered decommissioned strategic projects, including the extremely sensitive, highly classified remnants of Project Aurora. Cole, unlike Mason, never suffered from PTSD. He suffered from remorse, a quieter, more corrosive affliction, knowing precisely the ethical compromises he had made in the service of national security. Cole watched the flicker of weak, interior light piercing the dusty windows of the old hangar through the high-powered scope mounted on his dashboard. He had been monitoring this quadrant for nearly a decade, a lonely, soul-crushing assignment fueled by the DDA's paranoia that the past never stays buried, specifically the past involving Arthur Hale's final unsanctioned modifications. Cole was privy to all of Aurora's dark history, the successful but ethically monstrous early testing phases that had weaponized weather, including the targeted atmospheric destabilization that had resulted in the secret, catastrophic flood disaster in Laos during the Vietnam War era and the subsequent lethal tactical acid rain tests over the North Pacific. The DDA, still paranoid about international exposure, maintained Aurora and X-47 were simply scrapped hardware. Cole knew better. He pulled up the live satellite feed, watching the minuscule black silhouette of Mason's pickup truck tucked against the trees and the sudden, telltale energy spike registered on his internal monitoring system, signaling the activation of the old facility's backup power and radio link. He reached for a secure, antiquated military-grade radio handset, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. He didn't need to ask who the intruder was. He knew Arthur Hale had no other living family, no other potential link to the location or the override codes. Cole had run the full background check on Mason Hale months ago, noting the pilot credentials, the honorable discharge, and the clinical records detailing the psychological damage from the crash. Cole's face tightened, the professional detachment he usually wore slipping away to reveal a fleeting look of genuine pity and fear. He brought the radio close to his mouth, speaking the activation code quietly, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that barely disturbed the silence of the Suburban's cabin, his eyes fixed on the distant, silent hangar where a veteran was unknowingly walking into a ghost's trap. "He's Hale's nephew," Cole muttered into the handset, confirming the surveillance status to an unseen monitor thousands of miles away. A moment later, he added, his voice tinged with the weary knowledge of a man who had seen too much damage caused by the best intentions of science, the words forming a prayer and a grim prediction. God help him if he turns it back on. The quiet hum of his surveillance gear resumed, marking time until the inevitable next move. Mason and Rex settled into the vast, echoing silence of the hangar for the night. The only sounds the metallic pinging of the massive structure cooling in the darkness and the rhythmic, steady breathing of the German shepherd beside him. Rex was curled tightly inside the gondola, his presence a comforting warmth against the creeping cold of the concrete floor and the unsettling realization that Mason was now tethered to a dormant military satellite. Mason couldn't sleep. The pulsing green light of the X-47 link felt like an aggressive, watchful eye, demanding attention. He methodically searched the cramped, archaic cabin of the gondola, looking for a user manual, a maintenance log, anything that could explain why Arthur Hale, a man who had intentionally disappeared, would leave this terrifying relic behind. Beneath a stack of brittle, yellowed aviation charts, tucked tightly into a recess behind the primary radio panel, he felt the rigid spine of something unexpected. Not metal, but leather. He pulled it out. A thick, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by handling, the initials AH subtly embossed in the lower corner. Opening the journal was like stepping directly into the mind of the past. The initial entries were precise, almost clinically detached, filled with dense, neat technical sketches and complex, almost incomprehensible equations detailing the engineering and theoretical basis of Project Aurora. Arthur Hale's voice, filtered through the mechanical precision of his handwriting, was that of a brilliant, ambitious engineer, deeply engrossed in the physics of atmospheric manipulation. These early pages confirmed Mason's worst fears, describing the purpose of the hydrogen aerostats, not just observation, but as high-altitude deployment platforms. Arthur wrote explicitly about the goal: using the aerostat fleet to seed the upper troposphere with bespoke hydroscopic compounds to create targeted, overwhelming precipitation, a surgical application of artificial tempest to disrupt enemy supply lines. Mason's face grew cold as he read the clinical description of using weather as a weapon, the concept chillingly reminiscent of the random, unpredictable chaos that had plagued his final mission. Arthur detailed tests in the northern Pacific, referring to them obliquely as rainfall refinement experiments, which Mason understood immediately to be the very tactical acid rain tests Elias Cole had been monitoring, experiments designed to cause deliberate, targeted environmental catastrophe. As the entries progressed through the late 1960s, a distinct and jarring shift in tone occurred. The technical enthusiasm of the earlier pages vanished, replaced by a profound, agonizing sense of moral disillusionment. Arthur's handwriting began to lose its rigid structure, becoming more frenzied, more desperate. He detailed the growing horror of seeing his life's work twisted, describing the moment he realized the full, devastating human cost of the weather warfare program. They showed me the satellite imagery of the Laotian flood zone, my successful, overwhelming precipitation, and below it the casualty reports. The goal was logistics disruption. The reality was civilian obliteration. My science served not the nation, but destruction, one entry read, the ink smudged as if by a tear or a violently wiped hand. This deep-seated ethical crisis compelled Arthur to act. He secretly began a covert, years-long operation to disarm his own creation. He had painstakingly, methodically rewritten the core protocols of the X-47 control system, deleting all offensive atmospheric commands and permanently locking the station into a singular, defensive mode focused solely on passive, unrestricted meteorological data collection. His intent was to convert the war machine into the world's most advanced, unbiased weather sentinel, free from governmental or military filters, a global forecast network designed to save lives, not extinguish them. The final entry, scrawled fiercely across the last usable page, was dated shortly before Arthur's presumed death, and was not an engineering note, but a plea and a confession. It explained the extreme measures he had taken to conceal the hangar and the aerostat, detailing his certainty that DDA agents were closing in on him because of his unsanctioned shift of Project Aurora's mandate. I knew they would never allow the truth, that their weapon was now a warning system, to see the light. I had to ensure the link remained dormant until a trusted hand could activate it. The final sentence, the very phrase Mason had read the day before, now carried the full, terrifying weight of his uncle's sacrifice and hope. If Aurora flies again, let it serve life, not control it. Mason closed the journal, the cold dread instantly transforming into a burning, focused anger. His inheritance was not a relic of a ghost. It was a desperate, urgent baton in a relay race against a shadow government, and his uncle had been murdered for the hope contained in those final pages. The weight of the sky's memory was now his. A cold, heavy darkness had settled over the Montana prairie, pressing down on the hangar and insulating Mason and Rex in a fragile cocoon of temporary security. But the chilling revelations from Arthur's journal made any sense of true peace impossible. Mason spent the first half of the night reviewing the journal's frantic later entries, the stark details of weaponized weather cementing his decision that he could not abandon this responsibility. He was the last line of defense for Arthur's desperate act of repentance, and the silence now felt less like tranquility and more like the tense quiet before a counterattack. Rex, his usual calm demeanor subtly shifted by the charged atmosphere of the hangar, remained intensely focused on the thick metal door, occasionally emitting low, rumbling growls deep in his chest whenever the wind shifted outside. A slight, almost imperceptible sound that Mason would have missed entirely in his Denver house, but here it was an undeniable signal of intrusion. It was nearly midnight when the quiet was sharply broken, not by the door, but by the old radio set. The static, which had been a steady, white hiss since Mason first flipped the auxiliary power, suddenly coalesced. The faint green light on the console, the X-47 link, began to flash urgently, a steady, hypnotic strobe cutting through the gloom. A strange, high-pitched audio tone sliced through the radio, a series of rapid-fire beeps and whistles that quickly resolved into an unmistakable, synthesized voice, cutting through the silence of the hangar like a blade of ice. X-47 active link detected, initiating secure transmission protocol. The language was military-grade, precise and chillingly devoid of emotion, the kind of automated response designed to bypass human panic. A small secondary screen, barely bigger than a postage stamp and previously dark, flickered violently before stabilizing, displaying a set of geographic coordinates far removed from the Montana hangar, a remote point deep within the northern mountain ranges, marking the exact location of the X-47 station itself. The signal's power indicated that the orbiting satellite, awakened by Mason's initial power-up, was now actively reaching out, demanding a direct user response. Rex's reaction was instantaneous and decisive, escalating from a quiet rumble to a fierce, protective growl that resonated through the metal walls. He bolted from the gondola, his claws scraping loudly on the concrete floor, running to the sliver of space beneath the main sliding door. Mason didn't need the dog's frantic alarm to confirm the danger. The simultaneous activation of the link was too sharp a coincidence, meaning the DDA's monitoring systems, or someone else entirely, had been tracking X-47's dormant signal. Mason scrambled to pull down the journal, instinctively recognizing the need for absolute silence. Just as he shoved the book back into its hiding place, an intense, brief flash of cherry-red light swept across the narrow gap between the bottom of the door and the concrete floor. The light was directional, focused, and utterly silent. It was the cold, probing eye of a surveillance drone, systematically sweeping the ground for the energy spike that had just occurred. Mason reacted on instinct, the pilot training he thought he had buried deep beneath his trauma surging back with terrifying clarity. He killed the auxiliary power switch instantly, plunging the gondola and the massive hangar into absolute suffocating darkness, silencing the frantic X-47 link and the pulsing green light. He dropped to his knees, pulling Rex back into the cramped safety of the gondola compartment, forcing the powerful dog to stay low and silent with a firm hand on his massive shoulder. Outside, the low, distant thrumming of rotary blades, the characteristic sound of a high-altitude stealth military quadcopter drone, became faintly audible, growing louder as the machine circled overhead, searching for the now-vanished radio footprint. Mason held his breath, the metallic smell of the hydrogen envelope pressing in on him, listening to the agonizingly slow thwump, thwump, thwump of the blades fading as the drone moved away, unsuccessful in locating the origin of the momentary signal. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the game had officially changed from passive inheritance to active, desperate evasion. Someone wasn't just observing the hangar. Someone had deployed a clear physical warning, and he realized the grim cost of simply pushing a power switch. He had disturbed the dead, and in doing so, he had definitively awakened the Watchers. The silent retreat of the quadcopter drone did not bring relief. It solidified a terrifying, undeniable truth. Staying was no longer an option, and the hangar, once a sanctuary of secrets, was now a monitored target. Mason spent the remaining hours before dawn in a state of high-alert planning, the memory of his final catastrophic flight replaced by the urgent, immediate necessity of survival and execution. His PTSD, usually a crippling fog, was momentarily displaced by the sharp, familiar clarity of a high-stakes mission briefing. The only way to stop the Watchers from seizing the X-47 and reversing Arthur's ethical sabotage was to reach the station first. He had the coordinates, the journal, and the key. The only thing standing between him and the satellite was 20,000 feet of atmosphere and a hydrogen balloon older than he was. He secured the main hangar doors from the inside, a meaningless gesture against DDA hardware, but a necessary formality for his peace of mind, and turned his full attention to Project Aurora. The metallic smell of hydrogen, once merely chemical, now felt personal, a direct challenge to his deep-seated terror of aerial machinery. He worked methodically, relying on the rote training instilled by the Air Force, verifying the integrity of the immense silver envelope, checking the archaic ballast system, and inspecting the thick, heavy-duty hydrogen tanks. Mason realized the beauty of Arthur's simplicity. The aerostat was purely lift and control, requiring minimal digital interface, a design built for reliability over speed, perfect for a man who needed to focus entirely on the physical act of flying, rather than the dizzying complexity of modern cockpits. He packed enough emergency food and water for a multi-day trip, securing Rex's harness to a reinforced anchor point inside the gondola. Rex, sensing the shift from evasion to action, was silent, watching Mason with those unwavering amber eyes, occasionally licking his master's hand. Not a plea for comfort, but a steady affirmation of readiness. The dog's unflinching trust was a powerful sedative against the anxiety tightening Mason's chest. He climbed back into the cramped pilot seat, his hands, steady despite the deep tremor in his gut, reaching for the controls. The main panel was a riot of analog gauges. Mason connected the primary steering lines, re-established the auxiliary power, and watched the X-47 link pulse back to life, a silent invitation to danger. As he prepared the final launch sequence, he heard a sudden, sharp burst of static from the secure military radio he had left active. A voice, clear and cold, sliced through the air. It was Elias Cole. Cole hadn't abandoned his post. He had been waiting for the link to reactivate, confirming Mason's location. The speaker buzzed with tension as Cole's voice, rough with gravelly authority, tried to penetrate Mason's resolve. "Mason Hale, this is Cole. You need to abort immediately." "Aurora was never a weather balloon, Mason. It was a weapon. If you take that platform into the air, you are triggering a red flag, and they will shoot you out of the sky before you reach the coordinates." The warning was sharp, precise, and utterly terrifying, confirming DDA's deadly commitment to silence. Mason paused, his hand gripping the primary hydropump valve, the metal cold and unforgiving. He could still abort, abandon Arthur's dying wish, and disappear back into the anonymity of Denver. The ghost of the crash, the sound of tearing metal and the sudden silence of the cockpit, screamed at him to stay on the ground. But then he remembered the smudged ink in Arthur's journal, the images of flood casualties, and the final plea for life over control. The cost of remaining safe was allowing a weapon of mass destruction to remain operational, ready to be reactivated by the DDA. He looked at Rex, whose powerful head rested calmly on Mason's knee, the perfect picture of trust. Mason ignored Cole's frantic transmission, placing the final metallic, engraved steel key, the master key Arthur had left him, into the ignition slot. The entire control panel flooded with warm, steady light, and a synthesized voice confirmed the status. Aurora flight mode, manual, user authorization confirmed. He closed his eyes briefly, inhaling the metallic scent of hydrogen and confronting the altitude, whispering his commitment to the loyal animal beside him. Then maybe it's time someone used it for something better. He pulled the release lever. With a low, grinding roar of the winch and the hiss of ballast being jettisoned, the heavy silver aerostat broke free from its decades-old moorings and slowly, steadily began its ascent, carrying 2 lives into the forgotten, treacherous vastness of the sky. The ascent was agonizingly slow, a quiet, nerve-wracking crawl through the sky that lasted several hours, taking Mason and Rex far above the familiar tree line and into the desolate, frigid emptiness of the upper atmosphere. Mason was forced to focus with a consuming intensity on the analog gauges and the manual valve controls, a concentration so demanding that it acted as a temporary, brutal cure for his PTSD. There was no room for trauma when every pump of hydrogen determined their immediate survival. Rex remained motionless in his harness, his heavy body an anchor and his quiet presence the only sanity in the surreal, high-altitude loneliness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity suspended between the world below and the blackness above, Mason saw it. A colossal metallic structure, floating silently like a dead leviathan amidst a thick, unbroken layer of cirrus clouds. Station X-47. It was massive, a brutalist sphere of faded, utilitarian steel, coated in rime ice and metallic moss that glittered faintly in the weak morning sun, its presence a defiant, haunting monument to the Cold War's ambition. Mason expertly maneuvered the massive silver envelope of Project Aurora, using the last of his thermal lift and steering lines to gently nudge the gondola against a heavy, snow-covered maintenance hatch on the station's flank. He secured the aerostat's mooring cables tightly, the physical labor providing a necessary release for the accumulated tension. Stepping onto the station's surface was like landing on the surface of the moon, silent, vast, and uncannily still. He took Rex with him, the dog's paws finding uncertain purchase on the icy, grated metal walkways. Mason quickly breached the airlock. Surprisingly, the ancient mechanism was unlocked and unpressurized, and entered the core structure. The interior was a frozen labyrinth of pipes and consoles, abandoned for decades. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, only the persistent, unsettling whine of wind whistling through cracked conduits, confirming Arthur's solitary end here. The air was thin, smelling faintly of ozone and old electronics. As they proceeded into the main operations room, Mason found the nerve center bathed in an ethereal, soft glow. Unlike the hangar below, the station was not dead. It was running on auxiliary solar power, maintaining a low-grade standby mode. He approached the central console, a sweeping array of 1960s-era monitors and dials, and placed his hand on the primary control pad, the same metallic touch Arthur must have used 30 years prior. Instantly, the monitors flared to life, filling the room with pulsating green and amber light. A synthetic, female voice, calm and utterly detached, resonated through the empty station. "Welcome, Hale authorized user. All systems nominal. Awaiting mission protocol." Mason realized with a jolt that the station hadn't been sleeping. It had been patiently waiting for a Hale to return. Mason didn't input a protocol. Instead, he forced entry into the system's primary data core. There, he discovered two things. First, the comprehensive live feed of meteorological data, global weather patterns, ocean currents, and atmospheric composition, all streaming in real time, confirming Arthur had successfully converted X-47 into the ultimate data sentinel. Second, he found the classified directory, cryptically labeled Operation Cyclone, Weather Warfare Program. Inside, Mason dove into the logs, his breath catching as he accessed graphic, unedited documentation. High-resolution satellite imagery showing the before and after devastation of targeted Asian villages, accompanied by clinical military reports on precipitation efficiency and yield. He saw names, dates, and, most crucially, the original core programming commands. Arthur had not merely edited the program. He had removed the atmospheric command protocols entirely, replaced the offensive module with a perpetual locked loop of data collection, and then installed an encrypted self-destruct command that would activate if anyone tried to restore the weaponized protocols without his specific key. The terrifying implication was instantly clear. Arthur had not left X-47. He had been executed by the DDA because he had deliberately disabled their weapon and turned its ultimate power into an instrument of peace and truth. The silence of the ghost station was now deafening, filled with the echoes of Arthur's sacrifice and the heavy realization that Mason was now sitting on the most dangerous secret on Earth, the very thing DDA would pay any price to reclaim. The moment Mason's hand pressed the primary control pad of X-47, the faint energy spike was registered not just by the silent, orbiting quadcopter drones, but by the distant, secure monitoring system deep within a windowless DDA facility in Washington state. Elias Cole, still watching the barren Montana prairie on a secondary feed, was instantly thrown into a frantic, high-stakes emergency protocol. His screen flashed crimson, displaying a blunt, non-negotiable directive. X-47 active, Hale user confirmed. Execute, Phase 4, termination. Cole, his face a mask of ingrained military discipline masking deep weariness, understood termination meant the silent, untraceable destruction of the station and anyone aboard. He was a professional, an operator whose decades of service had been built on following orders, but the sight of the live meteorological feed, Arthur's peaceful legacy, now streaming from the long-dead station gave him pause. Cole was a man perpetually burdened by the past, his posture slightly hunched beneath the weight of years spent protecting secrets. His eyes, usually sharp and penetrating, were clouded by an old, perpetual regret. He knew Arthur Hale's work intimately, having been the technical officer responsible for signing off on early deployment phases of Aurora. He had believed in the mission, the cold logic of tactical weather advantage against geopolitical rivals. Now, staring at the termination code, Cole instinctively diverted the DDA system's automated destruction attempt, creating a momentary, silent firewall. He had to know what Mason had found, what Arthur had left behind. Using his Tier 1 legacy access, Cole executed a parallel command, forcing a system dump of the X-47 historical logs directly to his local machine, bypassing standard DDA auditing. He wasn't looking for command logs, he was looking for names. He scrolled through the digitized archives of Operation Cyclone, the mission that had used manufactured typhoons to drown supply lines, reading the clinical descriptions of collateral damage near targeted Asian villages, the exact event Arthur had been remorseful about. Then, halfway down the page detailing the sign-off for strategic deployment 1989, Cole saw it. A timestamp, a clearance code, and his own name, chillingly preserved in the unedited digital ink. Elias Cole, Technical Officer. Confirmed yield expectation. 200 civilian fatalities deemed acceptable for strategic objective attainment. The number 200 hit him like a physical blow, a wave of nausea replacing the professional detachment he had maintained for 30 years. He had never seen the full, unredacted report, only the sanitized version confirming the strategic success. He hadn't just signed off on a program, he had signed off on a massacre. The sight of his name, a digital ghost from his younger, ambition-driven self, shattered the remaining wall of his DDA loyalty. He realized Mason wasn't the threat. The DDA was still trying to erase the evidence he himself was a part of. Arthur hadn't been a traitor. He had been a man trying to fix the world Cole had helped break. Cole looked from his screen, flashing his own terrible signature, to the live feed from the X-47 station. Mason, a younger veteran scarred by a different war, standing vigil over the instrument of Cole's own buried shame. He opened a private, encrypted channel, a back channel he had designed during his tenure in Deep Black Ops, and sent a compressed data packet directly to X-47's maintenance frequency. His fingers, which had always been so steady when confirming destruction, trembled as he typed a message that wasn't an order, but a desperate plea for mutual salvation. Mason Hale, this is Cole. I know what Arthur did. I know what I did. If you can finish what Arthur started, then maybe both of us can stop running. Attached was a payload, the primary administrative override codes, the same level of clearance Arthur would have used, designed to permanently switch X-47 into civilian mode and link its data stream directly into the International Meteorological Network, making the secret impossible to recontain. He had just committed treason. The encrypted message from Cole arrived not on the main radio channel, but as a compressed data burst directly onto the X-47 console's maintenance frequency, bypassing the active security filters. Mason watched the text scroll across the screen, the desperate urgency in Cole's plea. If you can finish what Arthur started, then maybe both of us can stop running. Hitting him with the force of shared trauma. It wasn't a trap. It was a surrender, an unexpected hand reaching out from the darkness of DDA. Attached to the message was the payload, a sequence of alphanumeric characters that represented the highest administrative override codes, the very keys Arthur must have held to reconfigure the station decades ago. Mason knew this was his only chance, the final, terrifying leap of faith, and he wasted no time on hesitation. He quickly input the lengthy, complex code into the system's root terminal, watching the screen flicker from the ominous, persistent, awaiting mission protocol to a rapid cascade of confirmation messages. The system responded instantly, the synthetic voice announcing with chilling finality. Administrative override accepted, initiating civilian mode conversion, atmospheric command protocols permanently disabled. Simultaneously, a massive blinking icon appeared on the central display, far larger and more urgent than any other data point. A rotating swirl of color indicating a low-pressure zone rapidly intensifying over the South Pacific, a tropical cyclone. The data analysis algorithms, now running under Arthur's peaceful mandate, calculated the storm's trajectory and growth rate with alarming precision. This wasn't just a weather event. This was the precise type of engineered megastorm, the kind of target Arthur's Project Aurora had been designed to create and weaponize decades ago, now barreling toward densely populated coastal zones. The irony was immediate and devastating. The very technology designed to start this kind of destruction was now the only thing capable of stopping its catastrophic impact. As Mason prepared the final broadcast sequence, the X-47 station itself began to shudder. Not from technical failure, but from the sudden aggressive engagement of external forces. The station's environmental monitors spiked, showing a rapid, almost impossible drop in ambient temperature and a violent increase in wind shear, a clear indication that DDA, having recovered from Cole's brief interference, was attempting to destabilize the station remotely, trying to force it off orbit and into a terminal dive. The control room became a terrifying confluence of vital mission and existential threat. Rex, sensing the shift from stable silence to physical danger, stood up, his deep, throaty growl rumbling low in his chest as debris rattled against the outside hull. Ignoring the imminent threat of structural failure and the piercing shriek of the station's own warning alarms, Mason focused solely on the single, most crucial task, broadcasting Arthur's truth. He routed the X-47's unprecedented real-time storm data, the precise wind speed, projected landfall time, and intensity gradient, through the newly linked global meteorological feeds. He forced the signal through every available open frequency, overriding international aviation and civilian radio channels with a single, clear, desperate message. This is Project Aurora, civilian override, storm imminent, evacuate coastal zones. He repeated the transmission, pouring every ounce of his energy and the fear he had controlled for so long into the desperate plea for life. As the transmission package completed, the entire X-47 station pitched violently, sending Mason sprawling against the console. The mooring cables connecting Aurora snapped under the unbearable stress of the remote destabilization attempt. The hydrogen balloon, the only way back, was torn loose, its silver envelope shearing away. Outside the viewport, the massive envelope, no longer tethered and still inflated with volatile gas, ignited from friction and atmospheric pressure, burning with blinding intensity, a final fierce beacon of light against the churning blackness of the tempest. Mason clung desperately to a console handle, his vision filled with the burning wreckage of the balloon and the raw power of the weather data flashing on the screens, knowing the mission was complete. Rex, pressed calmly against Mason's side, remained steady, his eyes locked on his master, a silent promise of companionship in the final, terrifying moments of the storm. The morning arrived not with the gentle rise of the sun, but with the throbbing, mechanical roar of search and rescue helicopters cutting through the thin, cold air of the northern wilderness. Mason had no memory of escaping X-47. The remote destabilization attempt had pitched the entire structure violently, and the last thing he recalled was the blinding white fire of Aurora's demise outside the viewport, then a shocking, rapid drop followed by blackness. He awoke to the muffled sound of voices and the scent of pine needles, finding himself and Rex tangled in the parachute webbing that Arthur, with his foresight, had somehow integrated into the emergency escape system, a failsafe triggered by the terminal dive G-forces. They had crashed into a remote, snow-dusted forest several miles from the nearest road, a silent, merciful landing in the heavy undergrowth. The German shepherd, Rex, was already alert, his large, warm body pressed against Mason's side, giving a low, reassuring thud of his tail against the frozen ground, entirely unharmed, save for a thin layer of snow covering his sable coat. Search and rescue teams located them quickly, Drawn by the faint beacon of the emergency transponder Mason had manually activated before the impact. He was treated for severe hypothermia and a collection of bruising, but as he was loaded onto the helicopter, a wave of profound relief washed over him that had nothing to do with his own survival. News had already spread like wildfire. The unprecedented real-time data transmission from Project Aurora's X-47 platform, the urgent, repeated warnings of a catastrophic storm heading for densely populated coastal zones, had been received and validated globally. Acting on the data, governments had initiated the largest, most successful coastal evacuation in history. As Mason was flown south, he heard the broadcast from the control tower. The tropical cyclone had made landfall, devastating infrastructure, but its casualties were zero. Not a single life was lost. Mason's mission, Arthur's sacrifice, and Cole's moment of redemption had succeeded. The global attention immediately turned into a political firestorm. The source of the miraculous weather data, the Aurora civilian override, could not be ignored or covered up, especially when multiple world meteorological organizations demanded access to the still operational X-47 data stream. The government, unable to sustain the lie, was forced into a painful, messy declassification. The history of Project Aurora, the weather warfare experiments, the tragedies in Asia, and Arthur Hale's role in sabotage were dragged into the light. Elias Cole, who had vanished shortly after sending the override codes, was initially listed as a fugitive, but his actions, turning a weapon into a shield, earned him an eventual plea deal and silent retirement in exchange for testimony against the DDA's rogue elements. The true legacy, however, belonged to the data. X-47, still silently orbiting, was officially transitioned into the foundation of a newly funded global atmospheric monitoring system, permanently designated the Hale Atmospheric Network, in quiet recognition of Arthur's vision. Mason, exhausted but finally free of the cold grip of the sky's terror, refused all offers of medals, interviews, or government consulting roles. He simply wanted to be anonymous again. A few weeks later, he purchased a small, isolated cabin deep in the Colorado mountains, the scent of fresh pine replacing the metallic tang of hydrogen. He lived a life of deliberate simplicity, his only company being Rex, who now slept soundly by the fire, no longer needing to stand guard. In the corner of his rough-hewn wooden cabin sat a small, portable weather radar screen, a civilian model Mason had modified. He turned it on, not out of fear, but out of habit. The screen displayed the current continental weather map, but in the lower corner, among the diagnostic information, a faint, familiar string of data still cycled. Data source, Project Aurora, Peace Mode. Mason leaned back, running a hand over Rex's massive head. The sky that had once been the tool of his trauma and the instrument of terrible, invisible wars was now silent, neutral, and vigilantly watching over life. He smiled, finally realizing that both he and the sky had found their way back home. The journey of Mason and Rex culminates not in victory, but in grace. When the Aurora burned, it became a beacon for a new truth, that God grants us a second chance to mend what we break. This story proves that by choosing courage over fear, the instruments of past trauma can be transformed into guardians of life. It's a powerful reminder that every one of us, like Mason, can overcome our personal tempests and find healing. Share this tale of redemption. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe to follow the light. God bless all who are seeking peace.